All right, welcome to our explainer. Today, we're going to tackle a piece of medical tech that's, well, it can be pretty intimidating, the mechanical ventilator. We're going to break down how this life-saving machine actually works from A to Z.
I mean, we all kind of know it's a machine that breathes for you, right? But how? What's really going on under the hood? Well, we've got a clear roadmap to break it all down.
First, we'll cover the big picture. What is mechanical ventilation, really? Then we'll get our hands dirty with the control panel. After that, we'll look at the actual rhythm of how a ventilator breathes. Of course, we have to talk about the dangers, and we'll finish up with the most important part, how you get a patient off the ventilator and breathing on their own again.
Okay, let's jump right in. The very first thing you have to get your head around is that a ventilator's fundamental goal is life support. And here's the key. It's not a cure.
Yeah, this is so important. A ventilator doesn't magically heal the lungs. What it does is take over all the hard work of breathing, pulling in oxygen, getting rid of carbon dioxide. This lets the body rest and hopefully heal itself. It's buying precious time so other treatments can do their thing. Think of it like a bridge. It's a bridge to recovery.
Okay, so let's talk about the control panel. And to really get a feel for how clinicians run this machine, I want you to just picture 4 main dials. These are the big ones they have to master. First up, we have what's called tidal volume. This is basically the size of the breath, how much air the machine is pushing in. And it's not just a random number, it's super carefully calculated based on a patient's ideal body weight. You gotta get this right to prevent injury.
Dial number 2 is the respiratory rate. This one's pretty straightforward. It sets the pace. How many breaths is the patient getting per minute? This is absolutely key for managing their carbon dioxide levels.
Our third dial is FiO2. That sounds complicated, but it just stands for the fraction of inspired oxygen. So think about it. The air we're all breathing right now is about 21% oxygen. This dial lets a clinician crank that up, enriching the mix to whatever the patient needs to keep their blood oxygen where it should be. And our final key dial is something called PEEP. PEEP is this little bit of continuous pressure that's kept in the lungs even after you breathe out. Why? Well, it's super important because it acts like a scaffold, keeping all those tiny little air sacs, the alveoli, from collapsing between breaths.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. It's one thing to set the dials, but how do we know what effect they're having? We have to monitor 2 key pressures. On one hand, you've got peak inspiratory pressure, or PIP. That tells you the total pressure it takes to shove that breath in. It's a measure of resistance in the tubes. But then you've got plateau pressure. This one is measured when the air stops moving for a split second, and that tells you the actual pressure inside those tiny air sacs. It's a direct look at how stiff or compliant the lungs themselves are. Super important distinction.
Okay, so we've got our settings dialed in. Now let's look at how all of this comes together to create the actual rhythm of the machine, the breath cycle itself.
Every single breath the ventilator delivers follows these 4 distinct phases. It starts with a trigger. That's the signal to start. Then comes inspiration, when the breath is delivered. A cycle signal then ends that inspiration. And finally, expiration, where the patient just passively exhales. So it's like this little 4-step dance for every single breath. Trigger, push, stop, release.
And yeah, this really boils it down to the machine's core logic. For every single breath, the ventilator has to make 2 big decisions. When to start, that's the trigger, and when to stop the inhale, that's the cycle. And that trigger, by the way, it could be the machine's own internal timer, or it could be the patient's own little effort to take a breath, which is even better. So based on those principles, clinicians can choose from a bunch of different modes. For example, in volume control, the machine guarantees a specific volume of air gets in, no matter how much pressure it takes. On the flip side, in pressure control, it guarantees a specific pressure, which is gentler on the lungs, but the volume of air might change from breath to breath. And then you have these supportive modes, like pressure support, where the patient is doing most of the work, triggering the breath, and the machine just gives them a little boost of help.
Okay, now we need to talk about the flip side, because as incredible and life-saving as this technology is, it is absolutely not without risks. Using a ventilator is this incredibly delicate balancing act, and the potential harm has a name: ventilator-associated lung injury, or VALI. And this chart here just lays out the problem perfectly. You can see it's all about too much. Too much pressure, you get something called barotrauma. Too much volume, that's volutrauma. And get this, even just the repetitive stress of those little air sacs opening and closing can cause damage, and that's called atelectrauma. It really is a balancing act on a nice edge.
So let's break those down. First, barotrauma. Baro means pressure, right?
So this is exactly what it sounds like. Physical damage from just using too much pressure. It can literally pop those delicate little alveoli, just like overinflating a balloon until it bursts. And you can see exactly what's happening here. That high pressure causes a rupture, and air starts to leak out of the lungs into places it should never be. This can lead to some really serious complications, like a collapsed lung.
Okay, so that was pressure. Next up is volutrauma. This is an injury caused not by the pressure, but by the sheer volume of air. It's about physically overstretching the lung tissue. If you force too large a breath into the lungs, you can stretch those delicate structures way past their breaking point.
And you can see the damage right here. That insane amount of stretching actually tears the membrane between the air sac and the blood vessel next to it. What happens then? Fluid starts to leak into the lungs, a condition called pulmonary edema. It's really serious stuff. And finally, we have atelectrauma. This one's a little more subtle. It's not a big pop, but more like a death by 1,000 cuts. It's the injury that comes from the repetitive stress of unstable air sacs collapsing and then being forced back open over and over, with every single breath. And this right here is exactly why getting the PEEP setting right is so critical, to keep those alveoli stable and prevent this from happening. Which brings us to our final and maybe most important section. You have to remember, the entire time a patient is on a ventilator, the number one goal is to get them off of it. This process is called liberation, or weaning. But man, it is a huge step. So this leads to the million-dollar question, right? How do you know if they're ready? How can you possibly predict if a patient has recovered enough to handle the full, exhausting work of breathing all by themselves again? You can't just guess. You need an objective test. And that tool has a name. The Rapid Shallow Breathing Index, or RSBI. And it's actually a beautifully simple calculation you can do right at the bedside. You just briefly let the patient breathe on their own, and you measure two things. How fast are they breathing, and how big are the breaths they're taking? So you take the rate, you divide it by the volume, and that little formula gives you what feels like a magic number. And the key number, the one that predicts success or failure, is 105. And what that number tells you is incredibly powerful. If the RSBI is below 105, it means the patient is taking relatively slow, deep breaths. That's a sign of strength. They're very likely to succeed. But if that number is over 105, it signals a pattern of rapid, shallow breathing. That's a classic sign of fatigue. It tells you they're at a high risk of failing and needing to go right back on the ventilator. So there you have it. From the basic controls to these really complex lung injuries, the ventilator is just an incredible, powerful tool. And it really leaves us with this final thought to chew on. As our technology gets smarter and smarter, can we make the ventilator not just a life support machine, but a true active partner in healing? One that doesn't just breathe for the lungs, but helps teach them how to breathe again. You know, that's the future we're all breathing towards.